Hi, welcome to another week of Daniel. Now, this week I have been fighting over. I haven't wanted to do this chapter of Daniel, but here we are at Daniel 6, Daniel in the Lion's Den. The reason I didn't want to do this chapter is because it's been done so many times before. It has been done brilliantly, it's been done poorly, it's been done every way in between. It's been done. But my prayer is that as we come to this scripture, that God will show us something new. And if it's something of the same message we have heard before, that He will show us a new depth to that message as we read Daniel 6, Daniel in the Lion's Den. Let's start with the context of Daniel 6. In chapter 5, 30 to 31, we read that Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, has been slain, and Darius the Mede has taken over the kingdom. This is the Medo-Persian kingdom now that is the ruling power. Babylon no longer exists, and they are now the ruling empire. With a new empire comes new structure. Darius appoints 120 satraps throughout the kingdom, and on top of those, 3 administrators. So we're looking at the managerial chain, and Daniel is one of these 3. Now Daniel sets himself above the other 2 from his exceptional work. At this stage, Daniel is about 80 years old, so we have jumped a fair way ahead of time. You would think that with his experience, with the points behind him, with his position, there's only a few in the same level of power and even less above him, that he would be due for clear sailing. But that's not the case. Because the king wants to elevate Daniel above his whole kingdom, the administrators and the satraps want to undermine him and cut him out of the picture. To do this, they look for a charge against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They found that Daniel was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Now this is pretty amazing even for today. Even from a young age, Daniel has been able to maintain a level of integrity that has been steeped in his relationship with God rather than the circumstances he is in. He has not altered how he does business, even with the change of government. He also doesn't have this sense of entitlement that he's old enough now, everyone else can do it, or has this sense of being owed something in his life. I've been serving the kings for 60 years. The situation doesn't change how he conducts himself. But as the crowd that came against him found, there was nothing to charge him with. We read from verse 5. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the laws of his God." So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king. "O King Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except you, O king, should be thrown in the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So the king Darius put the decree in writing. Now the message of ego can get in the way of good decision making is a good message. But before we get on our high horse and start thinking, I could never be so vain as to think I would get sucked into a trap like that, consider the circumstances. Here is a new king ruling a new kingdom. Something like this might have sounded like a plausible way to unify the kingdom, to promote his name to all the nations that were widely dispersed throughout the kingdom. It also might have shown a solidarity in his workforce that was presenting this idea to him. So while we can look at it and go, obvious trap, it might have sounded like a good business plan to him. At the same time, if you're trying to pursue your own interests and goals, it can blind you to what other people are going to experience. So there's always that. So Daniel 10 to 11. What's Daniel's reaction to this? Now when Daniel learnt that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. This group couldn't find fault with Daniel. He did everything according to the law, except this. So instead of faulting him where his conduct was in the workplace, they created fault by issuing a decree through the king that was directly related to one of the things that Daniel held most sacred, his relationship with God. This was one of the few things, if the only thing, that Daniel would treasure more than his circumstances, even more than his life. So what was Daniel's reaction? Pray. Because he knew he could not let go of God even for a day, let alone 30 days. And to place God in the corner of his life instead of front and center as he strove to do every day would mean that he was putting his own needs in front of God's plan. It was placing his trust in himself in trying to save himself from his circumstances, where he needed to glorify God, ask God for strength, be thankful to God, no matter the external circumstances. He knew 3 times a day at least he had to come before God and place God back in the center. He had already started this process way back when he was 14, putting God first despite the circumstances. And here as an 80-year-old man, we see him continuing to do it. He knows that at the feet of God is where he needed to be. I always find it amusing when I read, and they found him praying. This was the intent of the edict. They knew that Daniel was going to be praying to God. They knew where he was going to be praying to God, and they even probably knew when. It was no surprise. The crazy thing is, if this group hadn't found Daniel praying, it would have deteriorated the trustability that he would have developed. It would have suggested that he was pliable to the schemes of man, that there was an element of corruptibility if you just targeted his life. He was able to be molded to the will of man. But he wasn't. He was found at the feet of God. Now this group have set the trap, they have set the scene, and they go to the king. They approach the king, make sure the law is still the law, make sure the king remembers what the law is and that the law cannot be repealed. King, is this the law you gave? Yes, it is. Can it be repealed? No, it can't. Well, guess what? Chapter 13 we read, Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. It is incredible. Daniel's been in the service of the kings for about 60 years, but in the eyes of this group, he's still an exile from Judah. Bitterness and division can still rear its ugly head years from when Daniel first entered the kingdom, and we can even see that today. Now, verse 14, we read, When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. We see here, even the king is under the law of man. Even the king, in all his might and power, cannot save Daniel from the lion's den. Now, just to jump into the New Testament a little bit, we read in Romans 6, by Paul's hand, that we are either a slave to sin or a slave to righteousness. And I think this paints a really good picture of that, what we read here. King Darius, intentionally or unintentionally, is bound by the law of man, whereas Daniel has a choice. He has chosen to serve God, and that is in spite of the circumstances. He has chosen the better option. So we read from 16. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him in the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation may not be changed. Darius is unable to help Daniel. He cannot save Daniel. He's already spent a long time trying to do everything he can. He now goes finally to the one true living God, the only one who has the capacity to save Daniel. It's still language of your God, but he's aware of who God is. Now Daniel's situation is not changed. He is still trapped by the schemes of the satraps. He is still being thrown into the lion's den. What we see in his life is not what we would consider a blessed life or an accomplished life, but one that is actually going through a really dark time. But he still seeks God first. Now, the king has a restless night. Doesn't even mention the kind of night Daniel has. And in verse 19 we read, "At the first light of dawn the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, who you serve continually, been able to rescue from the lions?'" Yes, Daniel is saved. God does what no other human is able to do. An angel comes and shuts the mouths of the lions, and he comes out without even a scratch on him. Now I'm going to jump to verse 26, the decree of Darius. He decrees, "I issue a decree that every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Now he still uses language of Daniel's God and he saves and things like that, and we're not told whether or not he comes to a living relationship with God as the one true God. Now this is a crazy story, and it's easy to focus on the part where God saves Daniel from the lions, and that is a great and victorious story. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't come back and see the trial Daniel went through first, the anguish he would have shown just in that moment where his life was at risk. Now he had a living relationship steeped in prayer that helped and encouraged him to live through the challenges, but he still had to live through the challenges. In his relationship with God, he clung so closely to God that he was able to hold loose all other things: control, power, prestige. He was able to even hold loose his life and all material things, because he hung on to God most. In this difficult situation, he saw 120 plus people coming against him to scheme against him, who wanted to see him gone. That cannot have been fun. That cannot have been easy. But he knew in those moments he needed to put God front and center, and God had to be the most significant and important person in his life. And that relationship needed to be the key relationship. Half the chapter is about the plot and his struggles, and even the king's attempt to save him. But we see Daniel's relationship to God is first and foremost, and God alone can save us, either in this life or the next. Just because we have a relationship with God doesn't necessarily mean that we are then free from difficulties and hardships, decisions and consequences. Daniel made the choice to follow God, and that landed him in the lion's den. But it was a decision he made because he knew who God was. What we are free from is having to do the difficulties and the hardships alone, in our own strength. We can pray to God, we can seek God, we can thank Him for the good times and thank Him for the little moments, even in the hard times as well. And we can ask for His strength to endure it. Now, as you go back to your groups, I pray that you read Daniel 6 again with a clean slate and discuss what you discover in there. I also encourage you to pray for each other and with each other for the strength to go through your daily decisions and to strengthen that relationship with God, which is such a precious thing that Daniel even held it higher than his own life. And I pray that you have a good week this week as well.